Before the video starts, I'd just like to inform you that this is a re-upload. After having tried numerous versions of this video, I've had to convert it to stills because YouTube keeps taking it down if I use footage. I apologize if this causes any inconvenience, but I've been unable to find any other workarounds. Now, on to the video. Greetings to you all. Well, it's been an exciting few weeks, hasn't it? People have been saying for years how bad the Hobbit films are, and it seems as though fate has finally decided to show us what bad really is. We all know that Rings of Power is beyond terrible, but are the Hobbit films truly as bad as people make them out to be? If you haven't seen my coverage of An Unexpected Journey, I'd recommend watching that first, as this is the second of the 3 films, and things that I bring up here will build off of that one. I will also be covering the theatrical version of this film as opposed to the extended edition, as this is the version that most people have seen. Firstly, I've heard many people claim that the title of this film is misleading. This is brought on by the word desolation. Now, this word does not have a definition that involves the death of someone or something. The closest that this comes to is it being a synonym with devastation, but implying that this should involve Smaug's death is a bit of a stretch. Instead, this references the name of one of the chapters from the book. In it, the dwarves and Bilbo pass near the ruins of Dale, and witness the destruction Smaug can wreak when he has a mind to. In keeping with the title, we also see how Smaug has affected the various factions, but I'll discuss that when we come to it. We begin in a flashback set in the town of Bree, which is still depicted as raining. How this place isn't underwater stumps me. Thorin makes his way through the town to the Prancing Pony, and there's a nice use of size doubles to show that he's a dwarf in a town of men, but shows that he's not as small as a hobbit. It's also not completely CGI, unlike most films these days, lending it a more realistic look. As Thorin eats his meal, he notices he's being watched by 2 shady characters. They begin to approach him, and he goes for his sword, only to be interrupted by Gandalf. His dialogue indicates that the 2 did not plan to meet here though. The 2 figures back off at the sight of Gandalf, but we are never explicitly made aware of their motivations. Gandalf questions what Thorin was doing in the area, and the dwarf explains that he was searching for his father. Gandalf is disinclined to believe that Thrain is still alive, but Thorin rebukes him and says that Thrain went missing shortly after meeting Gandalf. The wizard says that he advised Thrain to take back Erebor and kill Smaug, and he urges Thorin to do the same. Gandalf then continues that sooner or later, others will turn towards the Lonely Mountain if the dwarves don't do so first, citing that bandits attacked him on the road, and that they were carrying a missive of a bounty placed on Thorin's head. This explains why the 2 men from before were about to make a move on Thorin. Both Sauron and Saruman have had dealings with humans before, and there will always be those that are willing to work with darker forces. Thorin counters that he can't retake Erebor without the armies of the dwarves, and to do so he would need to be in possession of the Arkenstone. Gandalf then offers his assistance, and declares that they'll need a burglar to take the Arkenstone without Smaug noticing. So this is how the film version of the quest began. The only problem that immediately jumps to mind is how Thorin managed to get word to the rest of the dwarves to meet him in the Shire, unless this is supposed to be months before the events of Bag End. The time frame isn't made precisely clear, but this does take place a year before the other events, so far so good. Cut to the present day, and we see Bilbo scouting ahead of the dwarves after they made their escape from Azog. The orc hasn't given up on his vendetta, and he and his forces are tracking the dwarves. Bilbo eludes their detection, but he spies a massive bear watching the orcs as well. Displaying his knack for stealth, Bilbo escapes the notice of both parties and returns to the dwarves and Gandalf to report what he's seen. The rest of the party praise Bilbo's skill, and have come to understand that he is indeed not like them. They can fight well enough on their own, but that's not what Bilbo's for. He's a scout, meant for moving about unseen. They know that he isn't worthless, unlike in the previous film. This is a nice spot of progression amongst these characters, something that more and more media is lacking in, and something that many detractors of these films seem to ignore. Gandalf correctly deduces, though, that what Bilbo saw was a massive bear, and counsels that they make for an, at the time, unknown individual's home that is in the area. It's shown that the orcs break off their pursuit of the dwarves when they hear the bear, but for some inexplicable reason, the dwarves can't seem to figure out how to unlatch the door of the house until Thorin does so himself. I can't fathom how none of them noticed the latch, or why the latch is on the outside of the house. Also, the bear, who we will shortly find out is Beorn, the one to whom this home belongs, is outright hostile to them at first, but then is strangely indifferent to them when he changes back into a man. Some have said that the bear form doesn't share Beorn's mind, but we see later that he watches them in his bear form without incident. Gandalf's line about the bear being unpredictable, but his human form being more reasonable, doesn't quite align with what's shown. As night settles in, we see that the orcs haven't given up, and are merely waiting for the dwarves to leave Beorn's territory, apparently not willing to test themselves against him. They're interrupted by another orc arriving, who will be more important later. He tells Azog that their forces are assembling at Dol-Guldur, and that Azog has been summoned. This tells us outright that Azog himself is serving someone else, which will also be revealed later. We then get a short scene where Bilbo admires the ring while the dwarves sleep. As mentioned in the previous video, The Hobbit was written well before Tolkien's other works, and as such isn't always in line with them. It would have been exceedingly strange if Bilbo had never been affected by the ring before Fellowship. The scene shifts to Dol Guldur, and we witness Azog reporting to the necromancer himself, who informs the orc that he'll be leading their massing forces. We get a fairly large amount of characterization here, as Azog is willing to stand up to Sauron himself, declaring that he's only here for Thorin's head. Sauron doesn't care about Azog's vendetta, however, and merely dismisses him, saying that Thorin will die anyway. Just think about what it would take to mouth off to Sauron like that, even if it was subdued. Being that Sauron wants Azog here in Dol Guldur, the orc then summons Bolg, his son, who will continue the chase in his stead. Now I know that people who have only seen the films will cite that orcs are grown from the ground, but that's an invention of the movies, not of Tolkien himself. Bolg was the leader of the orcs that appear at the end of the novel, and thus one of my major criticisms of Unexpected Journey has been rectified. The next morning, Beorn then discusses the dwarves' situation with them. Beorn reveals that he knows of Azog because the orc murdered and enslaved skin changers like him. This leads me to ask two questions. Firstly, why are there still chains around your wrists? Wouldn't they break off when you transform? And if not, why haven't you gotten anyone to remove them? Secondly, if Azog was capable of killing skin changers, why was he afraid of you? This is a departure from the source material, and as such, no answers will be found there. Beorn then cautions them about Mirkwood, stating that there are evil creatures in there, and that the elves that live there are not like those of Rivendell or Lothlorien. Fair enough, that was the case in the books as well. He also states that he dislikes dwarves because of their greed, and their disregard for anyone they consider to be lesser than themselves. There's an amount of symbolism here, with how he delicately handles a mouse while it's roughly shoved off of a dwarf's arm. Thorin is unmoved by his words against his people, though. Again, Thorin is proud, and this will come up later. Out of spite for the orcs, though, he grants Thorin and the others ponies, and a horse for Gandalf, so that they may reach Mirkwood before the orcs in the area can catch them. As they reach the forest, we see that Beorn followed them to make sure that they followed through on their word to release them. Bilbo says that the forest looks sick, and asks if there's no way around. To the film's credit, Gandalf's reply of them needing to go 200 miles north, or twice that south to go around Mirkwood, is just as he described in the book. Gandalf, however, uncovers Sauron's symbol of the red eye upon one of the trees, and apparently Galadriel begins to speak to him telepathically. Gandalf then begins to depart, and his destination is a rather drastic departure from canon, but we'll get to that scene shortly. He has a brief conversation with Bilbo, and the Hobbit almost reveals the ring, but backs out at the last second. Whether this is the ring's compulsion or Bilbo being unsure of how Gandalf will react, though, isn't made clear. Gandalf's last words to the company are to tell them that they have to stay on the path at all costs, or they'll never find it again. He even references how Mirkwood used to be called the Greenwood, but that change happened long before what the films make it out to be. Stray from the path the dwarves do, however, and they begin to see illusions, just as Gandalf described. It's never clarified whether this is caused by the elves, Sauron, or the forest itself, but considering the elves we see later don't seem to suffer their effects, I'm inclined to believe that it's of their doing. Bilbo clambers up a tree to get a view of where they are, and it's a nice touch that the film even included the butterflies that were mentioned, even though they're blue instead of black. His view is different from the book, though, as he can see all the way to the Lonely Mountain from where he is, as opposed to only seeing the trees because they were on lower ground. Unfortunately, this is where the nightmare fuel begins. They are captured by the spiders of Mirkwood, which are Shelob's offspring, but Tolkien never told us exactly how they crossed into Mirkwood. Bilbo was apparently not subdued sufficiently, though, as he's able to escape, unlike the dwarves. Once again, though, Bilbo shows his worth, as he's able to trick the spiders while invisible through the ring. These spiders are not as intelligent as their mother, and are easily distracted. True to the book, Bilbo names his sword after killing one of the spiders, though the monster screams sting first. Bilbo begins to free the dwarves, though he's separated from them when a spider attacks, and he loses the ring. The dwarves begin to fight their way out, and we see more of their group fighting as they support each other whilst in combat. Bilbo locates the ring, but is driven into a frenzy when a spider hatchling steps on it. He brutally murders the creature, thank you Bilbo, and exclaims, "Mine," after getting the ring back. He then looks confused, then disgusted with himself. Not for killing that vile creature, but for how he lost it because of the ring. Remember, he has no way of knowing what the ring truly is at this point, and as such has no idea why he's so possessive of it. As the dwarves are making good on their escape, they're instead apprehended by the elves, led by none other than Legolas. Now I've heard no shortage of complaints about Legolas's inclusion, and my response to that is as follows. Legolas is the son of Thranduil, the second in line to the throne of the Mirkwood Elves. Where was he during these events? The short answer is that Tolkien hadn't created him at the time, but in canon, why wouldn't he have appeared? Especially while his father was interrogating these dwarves, or at the Battle of the Five Armies. It makes more sense that he appears here, rather than being conspicuously absent. There's no logical reason that he wouldn't be seen, and I imagine that had Tolkien first written The Hobbit with his later works in mind, something would have been said about him. The complaints at his inclusion here are stretching hard for something to complain about. There are legitimate missteps in the writing of these films, but this isn't one of them. We also see just how different Legolas is compared to his later self. While he was reticent and composed in the trilogy, he's much more confrontational and hostile here. People often say that there's no tension in prequels because you know characters will survive. That isn't the point of a well-written prequel. It's meant to show you how those characters came to be what they were, and how the world was prior to what you originally saw. It isn't meant to have the same level of stakes, at least not in that regard. We're also introduced to Tauriel, a new addition, as she wasn't present in the source material. I can see what they were trying to do with her, and I can respect that, but it isn't perfect. As I stated previously, the dwarves didn't have much to do in the book, so Peter Jackson needed to find a way to make them more a part of the story, instead of just Bilbo's baggage. Thus, we arrive at Tauriel. I'll say more about her as she becomes relevant, but for now, she's just another elf, and a close confidant of Legolas's, one that he appears to have a thing for. As the dwarves are led away, Bofur questions where Bilbo is, and Thorin looks about, now showing genuine concern, something that he wouldn't have done in the previous movie. Bilbo has invisibly caught up to them though, and manages to sneak into their fortress just before they close the gates. The dwarves are then imprisoned, and Keely has a short exchange with Tauriel. This is where their romance begins, and it's unfortunately rushed to an incredible degree, but that will be exemplified more later. Thorin is brought before Thranduil, and it's shown that the Elven King wears several rings. I can't say what the purpose of these are, as they're none of the Rings of Power, no, not that horrifically bad Amazon show, so they must be purely for decorative reasons. Thranduil does correctly deduce that the dwarves are looking to retake Erebor, and to do so they'd need to steal the Arkenstone from Smaug, which would then give Thorin the authority to lead an army to kill the dragon. Thranduil offers Thorin aid in exchange for the gems that he gave to Thror, but Thorin refuses. Thorin actually grins before he does this, and I suspect that it's because he knows that Bilbo wasn't captured. Remember, he knows that Bilbo freed them from the spiders, and that the Hobbit successfully eluded the goblins in the Misty Mountains. He knows that Bilbo's crafty, and he now trusts him. Thorin cites how Thranduil did nothing during Smaug's attack, and then gave the dwarves no aid after they fled. Thranduil then claims that he's fought dragons before, and part of his face appears heavily scarred for a moment. This lends credence to the idea that the prior illusions were his work, and that his face is actually scarred, and his normal face is an illusion that he has created. As Thorin is thrown in a cell, he confirms that he's placing his trust in Bilbo. The Hobbit spies on a meeting between Thranduil and Tauriel, there's sure a lot of T-names, where Tauriel reports that the previous spider nest was destroyed, but they're spawning more in Dol Guldur, and that they should lead a force there to kill them at their source. Thranduil refuses this notion, however, and declares that he's only concerned with his own borders, and that it doesn't matter if other lands are threatened by what's happening in the fortress. It's also confirmed here that Legolas has a thing for Tauriel, but Thranduil doesn't approve. A brief scene follows this, where Bolg has led a force of orcs to spy on the elven fortress. How weren't they affected by the illusions in the same way that the dwarves were? Was it because of their allegiance to Sauron? That's just speculation, so the question stands, along with wondering how they weren't detected by the elves. We get another sequence of Tauriel conversing with Keely, and while I can see what they were trying to do with this scene, it's just too little to reinforce the romance that the writers were going for. Yes, Tauriel would likely be in grief that the king forbade her from being with Legolas, but for her to immediately fling herself at a dwarf who is also their prisoner is just way too outlandish, especially considering that she still has feelings for Legolas. Bilbo then spies on the elves preparing the feast that Tauriel mentioned to Keely, and takes the keys to their cells, as well as observing their usage of sending barrels down the river. Bilbo then frees the dwarves and escorts them to the river hatch, where the workers have passed out from alcohol consumption. Unfortunately, their absence is soon discovered. Bilbo tells the dwarves to get into the barrels, and they vehemently object, until Thorin tells them to listen to Bilbo. Again, we get to see that the dwarves are loyal to Thorin, and that Thorin trusts Bilbo. Bilbo then lowers the lever, sending them into the river, but now he's stuck in the cellar alone. I don't know why he didn't just jump in after them, but it is what it is, I suppose. Some may have pointed out that it's strange that the elves rush down to the cellar when they notice that the dwarves have escaped, but they would be able to find out pretty quickly that they hadn't passed anyone further up, so down would be the only direction that they could have gone. Bilbo then falls through the hatch just in time for the elves to see it shut behind him. What follows is a creation of the film, as their escape was entirely successful in the book. Here, however, the elves close the river gate in time to stop them from getting away, but they're attacked by Bolg's orcs, with the armor of one of the elves doing nothing to stop the first arrow. Many have said that the scene in which the dwarves open the gates and escape while fighting the orcs goes on for too long, or is too comical, but again, these are subjective criticisms, not objective ones. There's nothing of substance behind those objections that would imply that the scene undermines character development or world building. I personally found this sequence to be thoroughly entertaining, but that's equally as subjective. Keely is wounded in their getaway though, and what is odd is that Thorin reacts to this, even though he shouldn't be able to see Keely from where he is. We're later told that this was a Morgul weapon, like the blade that the Witch King will use to wound Frodo on Weathertop. This is quite strange indeed. How would these orcs from Gundabad have weapons, arrows no less, from the personal armory of the Nazgul? Not impossible, I suppose, but extremely unlikely. We then shift back to Gandalf, who meets Radagast in a location that is entirely invented for these films. This is apparently a prison for the Nazgul after the War of Angmar against Arnor. Firstly, only the Witch King was responsible for the kingdom of Arnor's fall. We don't know where the other 8 were. Secondly, none of them, including the Witch King, can die from mortal means, and thus they could never have been buried here, whether alive or not. It's shown that the bars of their cells have been broken outwards, not inwards, indicating that they escaped from within. Gandalf then discerns that the necromancer that Radagast glimpsed was not a human, but rather Sauron himself. Cutting back to the dwarves, the party drags themselves back to shore, where they encounter Bard. The man demonstrates his archery skills by disarming Dwalin and Keely, and now is when Balin has his opportunity to show his skills as a diplomat. Orcs and spiders generally can't be reasoned with, but Balin was high in Thror's court, so this is in his wheelhouse. Balin says that they're traveling merchants, but Bard sees through Balin's lie, as he notes that if they were merchants, they wouldn't be where they are now, and the barrels from the elves wouldn't be damaged. Bard is convinced when they offer to pay, however. Legolas and Tauriel took one of the orcs alive, and he's interrogated by Thranduil. Tauriel is goaded by the orc, and the Elven King dismisses her. Thranduil then promises to set the orc free if he gives them information, and the orc makes a threat that their world will burn, and that his master serves a greater power. Thranduil then decapitates the orc, and Legolas is visibly disturbed by his father breaking his word. This lets us see the beginnings of the Legolas of The Lord of the Rings. While he's more hot-headed now, he isn't without morals. Thranduil then declares that no one is to enter or leave their kingdom, but it seems as though Tauriel has left the fortress, and Legolas is disturbed by this as well. Bolg's forces then discover the spot where the dwarves met Bard, as noted by Keely's blood on the rocks and Bolg smelling their scents, letting the orcs know that they're in Lake Town. Bard then smuggles the dwarves into Lake Town, speaking to someone on the docks and having the dwarves back in barrels and buried in fish. As he's about to pass into the town though, he's stopped by Alfred, one of the Master of Lake Town's lackeys. I've never shied away from praising that which deserves it, nor calling out that which is done poorly, and Alfred and the Master, I'd argue, are the worst part of these films. These characters are comical in both appearance and actions. The Master is a power-crazed fat man, and Alfred is his goofy lackey. That's as deep as it gets for them. While not every character needs depth, these two get a disproportionate amount of attention for what they are, and the Master affects the plot with Bard more than what this caricature of an antagonist deserves. Alfred declares that the fish are to be dumped back into the water because Bard isn't licensed as a fisherman. Bard says that the people in the town are struggling, and that there will be riots if they find out that his people have been dumping out food. This makes me question where the other man acquired so many fish, and why he gave them to Bard. Bard then smuggles the dwarves into his home, and it's amazing they're not suffering from hypothermia in that freezing lake, and one woman sees them pass. Thorin notices a ballista atop one of the nearby roofs, which he calls a windlance, and Balin explains that the last time they saw one of those was when Smaug attacked. He explains that only a black arrow from one of these weapons could kill a dragon. This is another departure from the source material. A dragon can be killed by a normal bow as long as you hit its heart. Their underside was their only weak point. The film version of Smaug possesses scales there as well, meaning that this is no longer the case. Also, you don't loose arrows from a ballista, you loose bolts. You also don't fire them, that's gun terminology. Thorin finishes by explaining that Girion, the Lord of Dale, missed his shots with these bolts. Bard and his son overhear this, and the son, whose name is Bane, objects, insisting that the stories say that Girion knocked a scale out beneath Smaug's left wing. The dwarves don't believe the tale, however. The dwarves demand the weapons they paid him for, however, but all Bard can provide are makeshift ones, citing that the Master has all of them locked in the armory. Balin then tells Thorin that they should take what they can get and leave, but Bard overhears Thorin's name, prompting him to leave to track down where he's heard of that name before. Now we shift to Tauriel, who has reached the spot where the dwarves met Bard. Oddly, it's now full daylight, whereas the sun was setting before. This makes me question when this scene takes place, as time is not on the dwarves' side, and thus this scene is hard to place. There are also animal remains here, and I have to wonder how that came to be. Legolas catches up to her and asks her to return with him. She refuses and tells him that his father will simply sit back and let these orcs carry out their plans, which she can't abide. This prompts Legolas to join her. Again, we receive more development for Legolas. While Amazon can't handle Galadriel, this inclusion of Legolas is more tastefully done. Galadriel was already thousands of years old by the Second Age, and had largely developed into the Galadriel portrayed in The Lord of the Rings. Legolas is a much younger elf, having likely been born in the Third Age. This means that there's still development that can occur for him, and he's not wildly different from the character we see later, even if he is rougher around the edges. As Bard uncovers a tapestry depicting Durin's bloodline, the woman who saw the dwarves earlier is announcing to others that there are dwarves in the town. One of them mentions a prophecy, which is another invention of these films. It says that the dwarves will go back to the mountain, and that the lake will shine and burn. Bane then arrives and tells his father that the dwarves have left, despite his warnings. The dwarves then break into the armory, but Keely falls down the stairs, attracting the attention of the guards. I have to question why he was brought along if he's suffering a leg wound. The dwarves are brought before the Master, and when Alfred denounces them as mercenaries, Dwalin declares that they're in the presence of the heir to Erebor, Thorin. Thorin's able to win over the townsfolk with the promise of the riches of Erebor, but Bard objects, saying that all they will do is aggravate Smaug, who will kill them all. Thorin doubles down, saying that everyone will benefit from Erebor's wealth, and thus the people side with the dwarf. After all, it was Bard himself who said that they were struggling. The vast horde of the dwarves would be incredibly desirable. The Master, seeing an opportunity to side with the people against Bard, then claims that it was Bard's ancestor that failed to kill Smaug, thus informing us that Bard is a descendant of the Lords of Dale. He then welcomes the dwarves and provides them with gear. The following morning, the dwarves are making ready to leave, and apparently they have left Bofur behind. How? Why did none of you wake him up? Thorin then tells Keely that he's to stay behind, as he'll only slow them down. Now is when what will later be called dragon sickness is really starting to visibly affect Thorin. Now this is something that was barely mentioned in the books, and we don't even know if it was a real thing, but in the context of the films, Having an intense desire for treasure that a dragon has hoarded can drive someone insane. I can't say whether this was anything Tolkien had intended, as Thorin in the book was greedy of his own accord, but when Scatha, another dragon, was slain by Fram, one of the people who would later become the Rohirrim, he sent the dwarves some of Scatha's teeth, saying that they had no such treasures. Scatha had taken treasure from the dwarves, and Fram's sending of his teeth does sound remarkably close to what happens in these movies. Whether that was supposed to be a one-off, or if dragon sickness was real, nobody can say for certain. Regardless, it seems as though Thorin is doing this partly out of concern for his nephew, and partly out of getting rid of anything that could hinder them. Oin and Fili then elect to stay behind as well, not approving of Thorin's decision. Bofur and the others then take Kili back to Bard's home, and the man almost refuses them, until he sees that Kili's condition is deteriorating. He lasted much longer than Frodo did. Bofur also says that no one will help them, providing an indicator to the nature of the people here. They were all on board for the dwarves bringing them wealth, but they won't help one of them. Just an observation. The rest of the company then pass by the ruins of Dale, and we can see just what Smaug's wrath can do. He destroyed this city without effort, and Thranduil is terrified of him, as is Bard. This is where the title of the film comes from. It isn't just what Smaug can do physically, it's what the mere mention of a dragon can do. This is why Sauron wants Smaug on his side. As I said before, if Smaug had been part of the War of the Ring, nothing could have stopped Sauron's forces from rolling over everything in their path. Bilbo then states that they're supposed to wait for Gandalf here, but Thorin says they have no time. Gandalf has taken it upon himself to investigate Sauron's presence in Dol Guldur, however. The Grey Wizard tells Radagast to send word of what he's doing to Galadriel, and we can see that Radagast doesn't want to abandon his friend. Gandalf insists, however, though he does acknowledge to himself in a whisper that this is probably a trap. If Gandalf knows that this is a trap, then his motives aren't so clear. Perhaps he believes that he can disrupt Sauron's plans, thus keeping Bilbo and the dwarves safe. It was his original plan to immediately return to them, after all. Gandalf then begins to use magic to dispel illusions, and we can see that Azog himself is preparing for the wizard. Bilbo and the dwarves then discover the hidden door, and there is an unfortunately awkward scene in which they fumble about attempting to find the keyhole, and as the sun sets, the dwarves just give up. This goes against everything they've been striving for this whole time. Why would they give up now? Bilbo even calls out how absurd it is for them to just turn away, and Thorin just lets the key fall in defeat. The Hobbit doesn't give up, however, and stays by the hidden door's location until the moon shines on it, and the keyhole is revealed. He then blunders around trying to find where Thorin dropped the key, only to accidentally kick it. The key almost falls off the ledge, but is stopped by Thorin, and he and the other dwarves have just miraculously arrived. I get that they were trying to go for some tension here, but this scene just undermines the motivations of the characters, and has them teleport around as needed. As much as I subjectively love this film, this scene was simply bad. Thorin then opens the door, and there's a short and touching moment as Thorin and Balin see the inside of the mountain they once called home, and haven't seen in decades. The dwarves then look at a carving depicting the Arkenstone, and Thorin reminds Bilbo that obtaining it is the reason that he was hired. Back at Bard's home, Kili's condition is eroding. Oin states that he needs Kingsfoil, an odd choice, as it isn't widely known for its healing powers aside from a select few, as it's rare and its properties were only documented by the Númenóreans, but in the continuity of the films, it's a weed, one that is fed to the pigs. Bofur then runs off in search of some. Returning to Erebor, Balin has accompanied Bilbo a short distance down the passage, and is describing what the Arkenstone looks like to him. This was mentioned in the book, as Balin did follow Bilbo a short ways, as he and Bilbo were friends. Balin even says to Bilbo that there's no shame in turning away. After all, he saw just what Smaug was capable of firsthand, and it makes sense that he wouldn't want to force anyone to confront that. It's a nice bit of subtly defining a character. Bilbo rejects this offer, and states that he has given his word. Once again we shift to Dol Guldur, and Gandalf is attacked by Azog himself. Gandalf holds the orc at bay, but as he has dispelled the illusion, he now sees the force of orcs and wargs that have assembled in the fortress. He dazes Azog and his lackeys, and makes an attempt to escape. Once again, I question what exactly he meant to do here. He's stopped by the necromancer himself, however, who reveals himself to be Sauron. The second of my chief gripes with the original trilogy is amended here, as Sauron does indeed possess a physical form. It's just that the flames surrounding him make him appear to be an eye. It's a spectacular piece of visual work. Despite Gandalf's best efforts though, Sauron is still stronger, even weakened as he is. Lore-wise, the wizards were Maiar sent by the Valar and did not have access to their full strength. Sauron has no such limitations, and Gandalf is taken prisoner. Now we cut once more to Bilbo, who has made his way into the vaults of Erebor, and I have to say that the thought of all that gold makes my head swim. Bilbo has the unfavorable task of trying to locate the Arkenstone in all of this, however. His searching, unfortunately, awakens Smaug, though. While this is entirely subjective, Benedict Cumberbatch portrays Smaug perfectly, capturing the dragon's vanity and self-assuredness masterfully. The animators did do a phenomenal job, though there is one small detail that irks me. Smaug isn't a dragon here. He only has 2 legs, making him a wyvern. Dragons have 4, and no, I don't need George R.R. Martin to screech at how they're supposedly more scientifically accurate. Dragons dominate both land and sky, and for their size, their wings wouldn't support their weight when walking. He played himself with those lousy wyverns in Game of Thrones.
Where are my dragons?
Yes, where are they indeed? Wyverns and dragons are not the same thing just because they're fictional reptiles. That's like saying that Cerberus and a werewolf are the same thing. The odd part is in the beginning of the previous film, Smaug's model featured front legs, meaning that an entirely new one would have to have been made for this film. Strange. Ranting aside, Bilbo puts on the ring to escape Smaug's sight, but the dragon's senses are too strong. He can tell where Bilbo is, but is perplexed that he can't see him. Strangely, Smaug seems to sense the ring in a small capacity, mentioning that Bilbo carries something made of gold, but is far more precious. Bilbo recoils at the term that Gollum used, and we see a flash of the Eye of Sauron. Considering that the Dark Lord's starting to become active again, the ring may be reacting to his will. Bilbo takes off the ring, and Smaug can now see him. Remember how Bilbo flattered Gollum to coax him into their game of riddles? Well, now he uses the same tactic on Smaug, now dialing it up to 11. Smaug's vanity gets the better of him, and he then shows off just how large and powerful he is, demanding more flattery, which Bilbo provides. Smaug then taunts him, asking if he thinks that flattery will keep him alive. But it's worked this far. It's the dragon's major flaw. He can't help but listen to praise that reinforces his ego. Bilbo then further distracts Smaug by giving him riddles when the dragon asks who he is. Smaug hasn't had the chance to stimulate his brain in ages, and thus is intrigued by Bilbo's vague descriptions of himself. Some have posited that Smaug may not be truly intelligent, relying on his raw power alone to get by. There may be some truth to this, but he does deduce that Bilbo is here for the Arkenstone for Thorin, and that the title Barrel Rider refers to Lake Town. Bilbo notices the Arkenstone amidst the treasure, and dives after it. Smaug's movement is felt and heard by the dwarves, however, and they begin to fear for themselves and Bilbo. This is even felt in Lake Town, and Fili tells Bard that he should take his children and run while there's still time. Bard then solemnly declares that there's nowhere they could go in time, proving that he was right all along. He's not gloating, only stating fact. Bard then reveals that he's had a black arrow stashed this whole time, which would make sense, as Girion was his ancestor. Granted, in the book the black arrow was in fact just Bard's lucky arrow that happened to be black, not a ballista bolt. But so be it. Smaug continues to follow Bilbo, taunting him and mocking the dwarves' quest. It's a bit cliché, but if you're a nigh invincible dragon and have a tiny hobbit at your mercy, and have been deprived of stimulation for decades, why not have a bit of fun? Bard and Bane then make their way towards the ballista, but the town guards give chase. I can't say why, really. Bane hides the black arrow in a boat as his father tries to elude the guards, but ultimately Bard is caught by Alfred and the Master just waiting in this random nook. The dwarves then question what they should do, and Thorin declares that they should wait. Balin then declares that a sickness lies on that treasure that drove Thorin's grandfather mad, and that Thorin hasn't been acting like himself, saying that the Thorin he knows wouldn't hesitate to try and rescue Bilbo. Thorin counters by saying that he won't risk the quest for the life of one burglar, but he hesitates as he does so, hinting that he is indeed being affected by the dragon sickness and is struggling with it. Balin then tells him that the burglar's name is Bilbo, and his fear and disgust are plain to see. Smaug taunts Bilbo about the spreading of darkness, implying he's aware of Sauron's recent activity. We see Gandalf in a cage hanging from a gibbet, and the wizard has a full view of Dol Guldur forces marching forth, while he's helpless. Just a tad bit sadistic, don't you think, Sauron? Bolg and his orcs have snuck into Lake Town, though, and they begin tracking the dwarves. Smaug is still taunting Bilbo about Thorin and their quest, and declares that he won't part with a single piece of the treasure. There are also several lines here that are a slightly altered version of Smaug's own bragging, which they didn't have to keep, but I'm pleased that they did. Bilbo notices that one of Smaug's scales is indeed missing though, meaning that Girion did in fact dislodge it. In the book, Smaug had golden gems stuck to his vulnerable underside, with a small exposed patch above his heart, but in this version he has scales instead, serving the same purpose. As Bilbo reaches for the Arkenstone, Smaug confirms the existence of dragon sickness in this continuity, as he states that he's almost tempted to let Bilbo take it so that Thorin will eventually be driven mad, but Smaug himself lusts for treasure too much to allow for such a thing. Smaug's grown tired of entertaining himself with Bilbo, however, and is about to kill him until the hobbit puts on the ring and vanishes. This perplexes him for a moment, and Bilbo uses that as a chance to flee. Bolg and his orcs spy on Bofur, and follow him back to Bard's house. The dwarves do their best to hold off the orcs, but they've been caught unawares. The orcs themselves are caught unaware by the arrival of Tauriel and Legolas, who then kill a number of them. One of the fleeing orcs shouts to Bolg that Thorin isn't with these dwarves, and the commander orders their retreat. Legolas gives chase, and Tauriel is about to follow until Bofur arrives with the Kingsfoil. She then stays behind to help Kili. Thorin has ventured into the mountain and finds Bilbo running for his life. While Bilbo wants to escape, Thorin instead bars his path at sword point, demanding the Arkenstone. Now we get to see dragon sickness taking hold. The Thorin from the beginning of this movie would never have done such a thing, nor would the dismissive Thorin of the previous film. He's broken out of his trance by Smaug's arrival, and the other dwarves just sort of appear here. I don't know why they weren't with him to begin with. The sight of the dwarves procs Smaug's wrath in full, however, and they have to flee for their lives. A cut back to Bard's home shows us Tauriel healing Kili, and we see Tauriel glow with white light. This shouldn't happen, as only high elves who have been to Valinor would appear in such a fashion, but the original trilogy did the same thing with Arwen, meaning that while this is a flaw, at least it's consistent with itself. The dwarves are now attempting to avoid Smaug, and the dragon passes above them, dropping coins off of his underside. I believe that this is a reference to the book, so it was a nice touch that they added it. We then get another scene at Bard's home, where delirious Kili wonders if Tauriel could have loved him, and I must reiterate that this is rushed. Not as much as other films I've seen, but it's still rushed. I could see a traumatic experience pushing two people together, but that needs to be shared, which hasn't happened between these two. Bilbo and the dwarves then discover that the only exit that was near the hidden gate has been collapsed, and that many dwarves died here during Smaug's initial attack. Thorin seems to come to his senses, breaking free from the dragon sickness for a time, and devises a plan to lead Smaug to the forges, where they can hopefully kill him, splitting up to divide his attention. Legolas then confronts Bolg, but the orc manages to best him and get away, as Legolas was only using Orcrist. Dual-wielding for the win, everyone. The dwarves then reach the forges, but as to be expected, they've been cold for decades. Thorin then plays off of Smaug's vanity in the opposite manner to Bilbo, enraging the dragon into breathing fire to ignite them and heating up the gold that they had contained. The melted gold then flows into a cast of a statue in the entrance chamber, and Smaug chases Bilbo into the room. He declares that he will kill the people of Lake Town for helping the dwarves, and Bilbo objects vehemently. This only encourages Smaug to do exactly that. He's distracted for a brief time by Thorin, who reveals the golden statue, which Smaug appears mesmerized by. It makes you wonder if dragons also suffer from dragon sickness in this continuity. The gold hasn't fully cooled yet though, and it flows out and covers the floor, and Smaug is buried in it. Ouch. Smaug isn't killed by this, however, and he makes good on his threat to head to Lake Town, while Bilbo can only look on in horror. Some have said that the film shouldn't have ended here, but I'm going to have to disagree. Not only does this create a phenomenal cliffhanger for the next film, but it provides the next with a spectacular opening. Remember, Smaug's appearance in the book was short-lived, and as such, the films need to maximize his screen time. So firstly, let's discuss the shortcomings. Getting the easy one out of the way, the CGI in this film isn't as good as what was shown in the previous film. Smaug was done exceptionally well, but some of the environments, particularly Erebor's halls and some shots of Lake Town, look jarring and out of place. I don't normally lean into criticisms of CGI, but this warranted a quick mention. Then there's the budding romance of Keely and Tauriel. I get that they needed something more for the dwarves to do, and that the Mirkwood elves in the book weren't fleshed out, but these two don't have enough of an interaction for a romance to reach this level this quickly. The Master and Alfred were cartoonishly evil, and why would they come after Bard once he's lost the favor of the common people, and why would they chase him on the street instead of apprehending him at his home? They know where he lives. Again, why weren't the orcs affected by the illusions of Mirkwood in the same way that the dwarves were? If they had some kind of special protection from Sauron, then even an offhand line or some showing of it should have been made clear. Why did Gandalf go into Dol-Guldur if he suspected that it was a trap? In the source material of the appendices, he was trying to discover what happened to the unaccounted-for Dwarven Ring of Power, which Thrain had possessed. He made 2 trips inside, and was never discovered. Here, though, we don't get to know why he's doing this, and we can only speculate. As for what this film did well, the cast were all stellar in their performances. Martin Freeman, Richard Armitage, Benedict Cumberbatch, and Ian McKellen all capture Bilbo, Thorin, Smaug, and Gandalf near perfectly. We get more character moments with the dwarves, such as Fili having innumerable weapons hidden on his person, Oin being their medic, Balin advising, and the dwarves supporting each other in combat. Again, they aren't the most earth-shattering details, but it's vastly more than the emptiness of their novel counterparts. Legolas's inclusion was a bonus. It makes no sense for him to be absent, and we get to see how this version of him begins to develop into the elf we see in Fellowship. It's not done in a manner that betrays the character. Looking at you, Amazon! Bard is an actual character now. In the book, he just appeared to kill Smaug, and that was pretty much it. Now we see his family, and he has his own ideals that he stands up for, which has put him firmly against the Master. So let's get to the scoring. Objectively, I have to give this a 6. It's not as good as the last film, but it holds up better than your average forgettable film. It's got some problems, but they're not as bad as the screeching of the common bandwagon would have you believe. Subjectively, this gets a 7 from me. Even with the flaws of this film, I still have a ton of fun every time I view it. Seeing Dol-Guldur on screen along with Sauron as the Necromancer was something that I've wanted to see adapted into a visual medium for ages. Even though Smaug was turned into a wyvern, his personality was spot on. While there are certainly flaws, this movie is definitely entertaining. If you've stuck around, then thank you from the bottom of my heart. I imagine that praise of this film isn't what most people would agree with, but I stand by my statements. If you found this enjoyable or informative, then I'd appreciate you leaving a like and subscribing to see more, and may all of you have a weapon in each hand.